Today is Thursday, March 13th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. The father of DJ Daniel speaking out about his son being bullied. He's demanding an apology. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to send us your thoughts. You can do it via email, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. It's quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We're getting through the news of the Cray here each and every weekday, bright and early together. And joining me today to get through it, CBN's Trey Goins-Phillips. And Trey, on the Focus story, you're taking a look at this church who's being targeted over their right to use a beach. What's up with this?
Yeah, so they, like you said, they have been targeted, or at least appears that they've been targeted by the County of Los Angeles for holding church services on a beachfront.
All right, yeah, it sounds like a huge no-no, apparently. So we'll see how they respond and all the details there. Looking forward to that on the Focus story. On the main thing, best-selling author and Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg, how he's tackling China's growing threat. That's coming up on the main thing. You don't want to miss that. All right, the news in 90 is coming up right after this.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem, and the city is restless. The people of Israel welcome Jesus as king, his followers ready for revolution. But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! How will you escape being condemned to hell?
Experience Holy Week like never before.
What have you done?
Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen, Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right, it's time for the news in 90 seconds. What should have been a moment of celebration for 13-year-old cancer survivor DJ Daniel it's turned in instead to an onslaught of political backlash online. He was honored by President Trump as an honorary U.S. Secret Service agent during his address to Congress, and DJ obviously was super happy with that. But media figures, online critics started launching cruel attacks, according to his father, Theodis Daniel, who says they've received harassing phone calls and online abuse, with some users mocking DJ's appearance and even questioning the legitimacy of the honor. Speaking to CBN's Tara Mergener, Theodis said he wants people to apologize. The hostility has taken a toll on DJ's fragile health, worsening his stress as he continues to battle against brain and spinal cancer. Theodis, who has dedicated his life to caring for his son, he's even offered money at one point to step away from the spotlight, an offer he and his family rejected. Despite those negative comments, DJ is remaining determined. He said, "Nobody can take that moment from me," the other night with President Trump at the State of the Union address there. And Christians, they still believe in miracles today, but many people still want evidence. Our own Billy Hallowell is exploring this debate in his new documentary, investigating the supernatural miracles. Make sure you check that out at cbn.com. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And we'll obviously be talking to Billy about this. He's been busy promoting the documentary here the last few days as it came out on Tuesday. And it's really, really good stuff. I mean, what he did was, and we'll get more in depth on this, Trey, but as Billy gets back into the mix here, once he's returned from all the whirlwind of promoting everything, but he basically went and they looked at all these individual stories, these ones that doctors couldn't explain, that scientists couldn't explain, and they went and they just ran the gamut of every possibility and talking to them, going through the details of the story. And it's really fascinating stuff. And it's just, no matter where you are on the spectrum on miracles, like it's really interesting stories to look at what happens here. But as Christians, we know God can do anything, right? I mean, if he spoke the universe into existence, then he can choose to heal miraculously whenever he so chooses, if it's part of his will. So anyway, it's just very interesting and fascinating to look at these stories that Billy singled out. I know we're going to be talking about them in the coming days.
Yeah, well, kind of rude of him not to show up to the
Yeah, right?
podcast today, but,
How dare
he's
he?
not here to defend himself, so I guess we will save the attacks for when he's back on the podcast. No, I think, this is awesome. I think it's great when we can highlight these stories because they are really good at just kind of bolstering my own faith, right? To remember that the God of the Bible is still just as active today as he was in the pages of Scripture, because Scripture is alive, and he still is doing miracles, and I think these kinds of stories can be a good reminder of that. They can also challenge you too, right? Because there are times when you pray for the miracle and the miracle doesn't happen in the way that you want it to, but God is still sovereign and God is still good nonetheless. I know that's something that's kind of a subtopic that they tackle in the documentary, and they go over some there too, addressing that question of what happens when I don't get the miracle. So overall, I think it's a great documentary full of incredibly encouraging stories, and I hope everybody checks it out.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Investigating the supernatural. Check it out at cbn.com. All right, we are going to go to the focus story now that we mentioned there at the top. And LA County has implemented a new policy. It kind of seems to be singling out Christians. So tell me about this one, Trey.
So, for almost 20 years, a ministry called Church on the Beach has been doing exactly that. They've been hosting worship services on Redondo Beach in Los Angeles. And historically, there have been about 120 people or so who attend these services. And according to the American Center for Law and Justice, the legal organization that's now representing the ministry against Los Angeles County, they said that the attendees and hosts of the worship service have reportedly gone out of their way repeatedly over the years to be good citizens, to be courteous to others, and they, are trying to be understanding of the fact that they're using public space. So if there's another event happening in the area, the ACLJ says that the Christian group, the church, they will voluntarily move their services elsewhere to avoid overcrowding on the beach. So all that to say, they're very courteous and try to be very respectful of the fact that this is a public space. But in October of last year, Los Angeles County reportedly changed their policy on using beach property. This was an out of the blue change. The Department of Beaches and Harbors announced it would no longer give out annual permits for religious activities and would, in the future, limit faith based groups to only holding 6 activities per year with these stipulations. Only 2 of the 6 activities would be free. The others would come with a $250 permit price. And the other 4 that came with that permit fee would be relegated to just one of 4 specific locations on the beach property.
Oh my goodness. Yes, it sounds like, I mean, if other group, unless they're doing this to any other group that wants to use the beach, it seems problematic. So what's the discrimination claim specifically?
Well, you just said it. That is the discrimination claim. The new
Yeah.
policy from the Department of Beaches and Harbors applies exclusively to religious groups, according to the ACLJ. A county official reportedly told a pastor with the church on the beach that churches, quote, don't need the beach because they can just meet in a building. And there may have been some leeway for a comment like that if, as you said, Dan, the reasoning applied to everybody. But it doesn't. This policy exclusively applies, at least according to the ACLJ, to church on the beach. So everyone in LA County is paying taxes to access these public spaces, and only religious groups are being limited in how often they can use them.
Very, very troubling indeed. Where does the whole issue stand right now in the process?
Well, the county has given a temporary permit to Church on the Beach, allowing them to continue holding services for at least the next few months. But once that extension expires, the ministry is going to have to obviously regroup and determine what they're going to do. The ACLJ is calling the policy change a clear violation of constitutional rights and a textbook case of religious discrimination. So they sent a letter to LA County on March 6th, demanding county officials cease what it's calling the, quote, discriminatory treatment of Church on the Beach. And the ACLJ also stated, quote, this case represents yet another troubling example of government entities attempting to push religious expression out of the public square. The First Amendment does not merely tolerate religious speech in public forums, it protects it. So at this point, the ACLJ is prepared to take this to whatever legal court it needs to, obviously starting locally, but potentially working its way up if it needs to.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, look, we saw this during COVID in California where churches seemed to be singled out. I mean, I remember us covering, Trey, a story about the worship band in the church, couldn't bring trumpets or something to the church. And, they were monitoring like the wind pressure and all these ridiculous things it seemed like they were doing in California. And you can't help but feel when you listen to the circumstances of the story that somebody was just annoyed that the churches were gathering on the beach and then tried to shut it down. I mean, that's just what it feels like.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think you're exactly right. We had those kind of trumped up charges against churches in California during COVID, churches in Canada that were completely shuttered, and then even Orthodox Jewish communities I remember reporting on in New York at the time, facing incredible discrimination. And it would be one thing if these rules were applied to everybody, but in 2020, and even in this case, they're applied expressly to Christian groups, it seems. I mean, I remember during COVID, and we talked about this plenty on the podcast, churches were facing either, complete closure orders, or they were being burdened with so many policy stipulations and dictates from the local governments that it was making it almost impossible for them to function, while Walmart and whatever grocery store you go to was completely open, free, and clear to do whatever it was that they wanted to because they were deemed essential, but a place of worship was not deemed essential. So it would be one thing, I think, if these rules were being applied equally across the board, but they're not. It's similar with Christians' concerns about the FACE Act, for example, when it comes to pro-life protesters, is that these lawsuits and these charges are being levied only against Christians. And I think that is raising some eyebrows for good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think churches, hopefully many of them took note on what happened after COVID and realizing that so many people in charge that are using that as essentially a shark bump to find out how much they can get away with in making churches be subservient to government restrictions and restricting the activities of the church. And I think pastors have to be aware and they have to be cognizant of these sorts of efforts that are going on, and to make sure that the next time there's this big a push to shut down churches and to stop worship, to make sure you stand your ground, because I think we saw the folly in that last time. And I've seen personally churches that are getting, ripped apart because of how they handled and reacted after COVID and the way the governments tried to shut them down, and the ones that perhaps capitulated too much caused a lot of consternation among people and ended up really creating some dissension in the church. So pastors have to stand strong and use discernment and wisdom, but definitely have to keep in mind the priority of the church over everything else that might be lurking in the background there. So definitely one to keep an eye on. Trey, I'm sure we'll update whenever the thing is settled at some point, and we'll see what happens there. But certainly a good one to keep an eye on, and appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today. All right, Joel Rosenberg on the podcast in 30 seconds.
Let me tell you, the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem. Crowds welcome Jesus as king. Rebellion is in the air.
Jesus operates outside our jurisdiction.
Rome will descend on us all.
But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves.
The world will never be the same. Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right. It's time for the main thing now, and best-selling author and Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg joins us to discuss The Beijing Betrayal, his latest thriller tackling China's growing threat, the risk of World War III, and what it all means for the end times. He's joined by CBN's Wendy Griffith for today's main thing.
The Beijing Betrayal is the last in a series of Joel Rosenberg's fictional spy thrillers featuring Marcus Riker that began in 2018. In this latest page-turner, China is the enemy, with Taiwan fighting for its survival, and the U.S. facing another plague.
And is Communist China simultaneously going to unleash a new biological toxin into the United States that could kill millions and millions of Americans and hamper or complicate or thwart the United States' ability to defend Taiwan and our alliance in the Pacific? That's fiction at the moment, but I think these are real, live, real-world threats that China poses. And look, President Trump is really tough on China. He's good on China, but I don't think he's doing enough to strengthen our alliance with Taiwan or give them enough weapons to make sure Beijing wouldn't try to invade.
Do you believe a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could literally trigger World War III?
I do. And the reason is because, like, most Americans don't really think about Taiwan. It's a small island in the South China Sea. It's not a country that most people can find on a map. However, Taiwan produces 97% of the most high-tech microchips that all of our computers and phones and AI equipment and so forth uses, as well as all kinds of other high-tech products. But if Communist China actually attacked it, and if they actually grabbed it like they want to do in the Beijing betrayal, it's not just the loss of one country. Every ally the United States has in the Pacific would feel suddenly like the United States doesn't know how to defend them. South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Australia, the Philippines, and so forth.
Well, in your novel, you have China secretly working with a radical Islamist terrorist group to bring about something far worse than 9/11. How likely is that scenario?
Well, it's certainly what Communist China wants, right? Like again, I go back to the Wuhan laboratory in that city called Wuhan in China, in which they were developing one of the worst viruses that modern mankind has experienced, what became COVID-19. But moreover, Wendy, global governments, but the American government shut down churches, forbade Christians from going to church on Sundays or Wednesday nights. If you had a casino in America, you could stay open, a strip club, a bar, a liquor store. No problem. Keep those open. But churches were shut down. This is part of Communist China's tyrannical biological weapon to neutralize the United States and our allies.
Let's switch gears real quick. What do you think about President Trump's plans for a new and beautiful Gaza?
It's a fascinating vision. Everybody's been criticizing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for not having a plan for a day after this war. But Netanyahu has had his hands full with getting this war won. The fact that President Trump has stepped forward, not a single Arab state has proposed an actual solution, an actual way to fix Gaza, pacify it, denazify it, de-Hamasify it, and rebuild it. Not a single Arab country has done that. As you and I speak, Trump said, I'll do it.
Do you think we're living in the end times, Joel?
There's no question about it. The fact that Israel exists right now and has for almost 8 decades, it's itself the fulfillment or the beginnings of the fulfillment of ancient end times Bible prophecy. This is Ezekiel 36. This is Ezekiel 37, as well as Isaiah, Jeremiah, the minor prophets. All said that Israel would be rebuilt and would be a sovereign nation state in the end of days before the Messiah, Jesus, comes back. Jews are returning to Israel. That's what my family and I did. And we've been citizens in Israel for more than 10 years. 2 of my sons have served in the Israeli military. And we are all in as Israeli citizens and strengthening the church through the Joshua Fund in Israel and the Palestinian areas and in the region. So, yeah, we're absolutely there. Now, what happens next? That's really interesting. And I'll just say in Zephaniah chapter 2, the prophet actually tells us that before the tribulation, all people in Gaza are going to be removed.
Right behind you.
Gaza will be abandoned, the text says, and then God will give the land back to the people of Judah. Well, that's the nation we call today Israel.
Joel, what do you hope people will take away from your new book, The Beijing Betrayal?
Well, first, I just want them to have a rip-roaring, exciting, entertaining ride, right? And so where they're up all night, and these chapters, they're short, they're intense, cliffhanger endings. They're like Pringles. You can't eat just one. But I also want to educate. I want to warn. Communist China is a major threat, not only to the United States and our allies in the Pacific, But China's building a very dangerous strategic alliance with the Iranian regime.
And that makes China's communist regime a serious threat to Israel and the Jewish people. Rosenberg hopes the Trump administration, Congress, and Israel will make it a priority to counter the range of threats from Beijing before it's too late. Wendy Griffith, CBN News.
All right, Wendy, thanks for that conversation with Joel. Always appreciate Joel stopping by to CBN. Appreciate his perspective, and his books are always entertaining as well. All right, that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today. For one last thing, we're going to look at Psalm 119, 105. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And it's just a reminder that all things that we do in life, we should be always consulting the word and constantly being in the word and not trying to go at it alone with our own thoughts, our own ideas, our own wisdom without tying that right to Scripture.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind here is just the scriptural encouragement that our hearts are deceitful, right? So we need to trust in God to illuminate truth for us, because we are not very good at finding truth on our own.
No, we certainly are not. That's part of our human problem. Human problem as fallen creatures. So good word there as we wrap up this Friday Junior edition of the Quick Start Podcast. Make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back here tomorrow with more. Friday's up next. God bless. We'll see you then.